And welcome to Arte Julia. Thank you all very much for coming out on a very wet and rainy night for a very important book and a very important discussion. We're excited to be hosting this evening a brand new book just released this month, April, by Larissa Babij. Did I say it right? Babij. Ukrainian American writer. She was living in Kyiv at the time in February 2022 when there was an invasion of the city. This book is about her experience, which I think will be very interesting to hear. She's a graduate alumni of Barnard College, Columbia, and joining us tonight in conversation is Marci Shore. Marci is an associate professor at Yale and an expert on the history of 20th and 21st century Central and Eastern Europe. She has also written a book, The Ukrainian Night, which we have here tonight, and they will be in conversation. There will be time for question and answer, and afterwards there will be signings as well. So thank you for coming. Help me welcome them.
I was very happy to see all of you, and I would just like to say it's a great honor to be joined by Marci Shore, who I met in person for the first time today, even though we've corresponded for some years. And Marci is someone who has written the history, or a history, but really, one of the first and kind of important histories of the Maidan Revolution of Dignity, which I participated in to some extent. And reading these pages today that are written like in the voices of the people who participated in it, it's just really important that this chronicle exists, because the events of Maidan were really formative for Ukrainian people, individuals who lived through them, and kind of in aggregate. And I think they very much were kind of the first step of a process that is still going on today as Ukrainians defend their country against Russian invasion at a massive scale right now. And I think the interesting thing, and Marci mentions it in her book, is that like when you're living in such events of such intensity, and they're followed by events of more intensity, you never really have time to stop and reflect on them. So, I wasn't able to compose sentences like that in 2013 and 2014. And so I'm so grateful that Marci was able to, from, the distance and certain intellectual background that she has and brings to this, to be able to record this history of a really formative moment for the Ukrainian people. And it's definitely is a kind of prerequisite, to the book that I've written, which is just 2022, 10 years later. And it's just like a sliver of a much larger process that we're still living through today. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to say to begin, or if I should read
Well, should we tell them a little bit about your book? So Larissa, I because I'm like a fan of dance, I have to mention this. So in addition to being a writer and a translator, Larissa is also a dancer. And so not only has she lived in Kyiv since 2005, writing criticism and writing journalism, and writing her own perceptions, but she's also been very active in this art scene. So she comes from a very interesting place with also a lot of experience in experimental theater. I hope we'll have some time to talk about some of the theater essays. I know there are lots of things I'd like to ask you about that might take us away from the subject that we probably won't have time to do, but I want to mention that nonetheless, there's a very interesting experimental theater scene, the kind of thriving art scene, in Kyiv. And the context for this book is in some ways, and it's also the context of the revolution, like this place, this city, this country that is going through this process of coming of age, as we all are. There are things about it that are beautiful and invigorating, and you have your favorite cafes and the hipster hangouts and the galleries, and like you learned Feldenkrais and you teach movement, and there's this whole rich life going on. And then suddenly there's a World War II style largest land invasion of Europe to happen in the past 80 years. And so the disconnect in some ways between those things, like you have your life and you have your cat and you have your dance classes and you have your favorite coffee shops and you have your friends and you have and then suddenly you're being shelled in a place that didn't have that feeling. I one of the things I want to ask you to do after you read an excerpt is go back to that moment on February 24th where something that is not necessarily a surprise because everyone was watching those Russian troops build up on the border can nonetheless be a shock. And that difference between surprise and shock and what does it mean to be shaken and have history kind of torn at that moment. But first, let me ask Larissa to read an excerpt so you get a sense of her voice in this book, which is a very personal book. And it's reflective, both self-reflective, and it's also reflective about the people around her. And then I'll have her answer the question.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to read you the book's prologue, which was actually written at the very last day of 2022. It will give you some images of what you'll find throughout the book. December 31st, Kyiv. Drinking coffee in Kyiv, my friend, the physical therapist, says we all have PTSD. I've never been a fan of diagnoses. This is both a gift and a fault. It's warm at home and the lights are on. No words can describe how tired I am. On Monday, I met a soldier who had shrapnel lodged in many parts of his body for a couple months while he was a prisoner of war. The pieces were surgically removed only after he returned to Ukraine in the fall. Sitting in a cafe, I marvel at this tall young man, still underweight, with bright, intelligent eyes. He came in on his own two legs. It's the third day that he's walking unassisted. After the explosion that filled his body with shards of metal and glass, he could only move his head. What did you do to get from that state to this? I ask in wonder, watching his hands and fingers move lightly, same as anybody else's. We talk about how the body naturally repels foreign objects. Small pieces of metal or glass would gradually migrate toward the surface of his skin. And you pull them out with your fingers? Yes, he says, smiles. My grandmother is missing the nail on one of her big toes. It's the result of an infection that appeared just after the war. She was moving westward through Germany to avoid Soviet forced repatriation, sleeping in fields and dirty vacated barracks, eating old potatoes or whatever her band of young traveling companions could scavenge. It was becoming too painful to walk when she happened upon a doctor who had the instruments to remove the infected part of her toe. Growing up in the US, I was hungry for stories from the war. I yearned to understand what it was like, what happened there. What did people go through that afterward they were so reluctant to talk about? All that they told me with utter conviction was, may you never have to see what I did. There's a threshold between comfortable, clean, civilized life and the brutality of war. From the vantage point of the former, it's comfortable, clean, civilized life, the border may seem solid, even permanent. Anyone who has crossed it by chance knows that it can be shattered in an instant. I remember the woman from Mariupol who agreed to be interviewed for French television in March, just after arriving at the train station in Lviv. Her willingness to talk and her insistence hinted that she was well off. Anna was a lawyer, now bound for Bali, after spending 3 weeks in a dark basement as her city was bombed relentlessly by the Russians. Deprived of light, they were afraid they would go blind. She had a message for the Red Cross and every international body. Use your influence to get people out of Mariupol. These people want to live. Tens of thousands, maybe 100,000, we don't know, of Mariupol's residents have died. Those that remain in the city are wintering in apartments whose shattered windows are covered in flimsy plastic. The occupying Russian forces are renovating the drama theater that they bombed in the spring, killing hundreds who were sheltering inside. We will never know exactly how many people died in the city or what they experienced before their deaths. A person flees from a war zone, dirty, smelly, terrified, and then you wash them, feed them, give them a clean, warm place to sleep, and they still have the war with them, everything they lived through. A woman at a weekly support group for IDPs shares, "I don't like that I hate. I don't like that they've made us hate. When my grandparents despised the Russians, it wasn't through prejudice. It was a judgment based on experience." Is the wish to permanently secure the wall protecting the sheltered life of civilization from the horrors of war the desire to remain innocent? To protect oneself from sharing the hardships that others have endured? To shield oneself from one's own darkness and ugliness? Perhaps our great error or crime is succumbing to the illusion that the civilized world can be contained. We've sealed off the cracks through which people could slip out to scout the dangerous, unruly territories beyond and return. We've taken it all in so that there is no longer an outside. And so the war starts to happen here on the territory of the civilized world. And the rest that follows is precisely that, as Marci mentioned, the story of how the civilized world, everything that you've known until that point can be changed at a moment when you least expect it.
Why don't you start by this is a book in many ways about making choices, you know, and the constant need to make choices, and then the rethinking of the choices, you know, and the first choice you make in this book is that people are telling you the Russian troops are building up along the border. We all knew they were building up along the border. We were all watching. You know, I didn't know whether or not in the end Putin was going to invade, but it wasn't as if nobody knew that something threatening was happening. And so, and you're an American, you know, with an American passport. So for you, it was particular. You could have, at any moment, you could have left. And people like your family were urging you to leave. So before this starts, you say, no, I'm staying. You don't think it's going to happen. And then February 24th happens and you decide to stay. Can you talk about that moment of decision? I mean, that is the big moment of existential choice. What makes you decide to stay?
Yeah, I made the decision. It was the weekend before February 24th. You know, I as an American citizen, I even got a personal phone call from the embassy in Kyiv, you know, asking me what my plans were, encouraging me to leave. And it was after my sister sent me an email. My sister has a sense. You know, she's very easygoing. And then like when she like says something strongly, you realize you're like, it's usually right. So she sent me this email and it made me really mad. And what did I do? I wrote a Facebook post. You know, I wrote a Facebook post basically explaining that amongst my friends in Ukraine, we've been living in war for 8 years already. And we knew that Russia had a tendency of using these sort of, you know, loud proclamations to frighten people into submission without doing anything. And so I wasn't thinking about some kind of like potential futures. I was thinking about the fact that if I flee preemptively and everybody else flees preemptively, you're going to have an empty country. Russia's going to come in, and who's going to take care of it? And so that was my thinking. I had no idea what was coming. and honestly, you know, I think I do mention this somewhere in the book, is that like when I heard those first explosions, it was like 4 o'clock in the morning. They happened at, and historically, yes, it was at 5 o'clock in the morning. You know, people have recorded that, but you know, a friend of mine had called me, and he had been really paranoid, you know, leading in these weeks leading up to it. So I was like, maybe he's just imagining it. You know, I heard these kind of dim booms, but I really wanted to believe that it was just my imagination. I was really tired. I had gone to bed late. Like, I so did not want it to be true. That was like the ultimate thing. And it's you're kind of torn between this like I should do something, right? There's bombs going off in my city. I'm wearing my nightgown. I think the first thing I did, I got up and I put tape on my windows. But that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to put, this is actually on the cover, you're supposed to put tape on your windows so that if they shatter, you won't have little pieces, but you know, there'll be less glass kind of coming in into your apartment. And it was really thanks to a handful of my Ukrainian friends that were a little bit more clear-headed than I was. You know, the first decision that we took, we all lived on the left bank of the city, and there was a thought that if the Russians were going to invade, that even the Ukrainians would blow up the bridges between the two banks to prevent the Russians from being able to cross into the other side. And so we decided we'd be safer if we were on the right bank. So that was sort of the first step. And everything that happened after that, it was a step by step. We didn't have a plan. We had 3 cats, 5 people, cell phones, we had internet, and our own wits, and they were kind of in shock.
Yeah, I'm still in awe of this because I was in New Haven, and I was, in our house in New Haven, and 4 a.m. Kyiv time is 9 p.m. New Haven time. So we were all awake.
That was intentional.
Right. We were all awake, and Zelensky had just given this address, calling on the Russian people to please not do this, which was one of the most moving addresses I had ever heard. I mean, Zelensky tries to call Putin. Putin doesn't take the phone call. Zelensky makes this address directly to the Russian people and says, please don't do this. Is this really what you want? If you come here and you try to kill us, well, we will defend ourselves. He has this famous line, you won't see our backs, you'll see our faces, we'll look you in the eye, but this is not what we want. And I was blown away by that. I thought I had been an agnostic about Zelensky until then, but that felt so real to me. And I thought only a native speaker could have spoken to other native speakers with that kind of intimacy. And then despite that, I mean, that was after midnight Kyiv time, and then there was this, Polish friends of mine had run over after the speech saying, you have to listen to this. So we're all gathered around the kitchen, we're watching the streaming coming in. And I'm not even Ukrainian. I wasn't Ukraine. I was absolutely paralyzed. I was paralyzed. I was sick. I was we were all terrified. We were just watching the news. I mean, I felt like this is it, this Third World War. History has just torn itself in half. And I didn't even have to decide whether to flee. So the fact that you were able to come up with a plan, I'm just very impressed by it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've noticed, I've talked to other friends in the States who experienced the witnessing of the beginning of the war from here, and they're these very 2 different things that a lot of my Ukrainian friends, numerous people told they cried for 24 hours for several days, they couldn't stop crying. And they were the ones that could do that, because those of us that were there, we couldn't. Your body just, you mentioned dancing, and there's a lot of the body in here. This book is also, it's about the physiological experience of, the body itself. It has a lot of mechanisms by which to act appropriately. And in the sense that if you are in the United States and you don't have to flee, you can have an emotional response. Whereas when you have to do something, no clue what to do. You don't know what's going to happen. It's a completely different state. I mean, one of the things actually with this group of friends, I'm sure it happened to a lot of people, around the middle of the day, as we were trying to figure out what was our plan to the next step, somebody cooked up some food and we tried to eat, and you had to force yourself to eat because you don't want to eat. Your body isn't relaxed enough to be able to digest food. And yet we're the logical mind says, no, we have to eat something because we don't know, what's going to be next. And so it's very visceral, the way your relationship not only to your environment but to the events.
So on that note, a lot of this, there's a lot of motifs in this book I'm kind of tempted to pull out. One of them is about the body. I mean, one of the things that struck me about your book, and of course I've been constantly reading accounts of this war and talking to people in this war, and sometimes visiting Ukraine. But one thing that's very unique about you is that the focus on the body, because you're a person who had been professionally and personally engaged with the somatic experience before this and during this, which is something that I hadn't thought through before. And part of that also seems to blend in to a certain extent with this feeling you have that there's things inside you that almost come intergenerationally, through this history of trauma and this history of war, this history of fleeing Russians, and this, and maybe you could talk about how those things do or don't come together. This you're experiencing this war is also something that's experienced through your body. I had also marked that passage about pulling out the objects from, because it's so like it's so striking, like that how war is something you experience with your body, and it's also a moment where you can't ignore the body. There's a moment of kind of biological irreducibility. We all like to think that all these things are cultural constructs, but then you get to this, we all like to think now that gender is a cultural construct, but then you get to accounts of rape, and the ways in which men and women's bodies can be treated differently, that's irreducible and can't be reduced to cultural constructs. And also then how you feel that almost kind of genetically, like what you've taken from your grandparents fleeing in 1943 and the memories of the Holodomor, and what you feel like you've carried with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of shocking and disturbing, and tragic in the sense that my own experience living through Russian invasion and war and defense, it opened up a completely new perspective to the experiences of my grandparents, which, the more I hadn't really thought about it until very recently, is that, for all that I've always been sure that my grandparents passed something on to me, they couldn't have described their experiences. It's not simply the matter that they were, closed and didn't want to talk about it, but like, given where I grew up in the United States and, the Connecticut suburbs, there was no frame of reference through which they could have told me what they lived through in any way that I could understand. I could only understand it by having to go through it myself, which is, it's ridiculous. I mean, I felt ashamed on February 24th, honestly, that I was there, that I hadn't, taken the lessons of my grandparents, to keep yourself safe or whatever. But I guess I needed to have that experience, perhaps, to have this other perspective on their life. I mean, it's a strange thing, the way that, generationally, and even person to person, I think this is something that's amazing about the body, is that we pass things to each other in ways that you can't describe in words. You can't catalog in an internet database. And they're very visceral, and but your own body is a huge source of knowledge as well. And if I can kind of continue this theme, is I think the other thing that really, my experience staying in Ukraine has kind of affirmed is this. Okay, this is something I've been thinking about for decades, including with the dancers and the contemporary artists I was working with before. But what, it kind of what Ukraine's resistance has shown is how much the physical body is political. It's politics, real politics, that make the world what it is. It's what you do. It's where you stand. It's, do you leave your body in Kyiv, in your home, or in Lviv or somewhere, or do you cross the border and, carry Ukraine in your heart? Which is also, I mean, that's a relevant choice for people. It's a relevant choice. But if everybody did it, we wouldn't have Ukraine. I mean, it's, and so this kind of insight of staying and keeping my body in a place. Okay, or you could put it another way. I can stay in a place where I risk danger. My body is definitely in risk every time I'm in Kyiv, in my apartment. It could be hit by a Russian missile. That's always possible. Is that worth the risk? Or, kind of the flip side is, if I make protecting my physical body the utmost priority, more important than anything else. You know, what else do I have to give up?
Let me then keep going with this question of choice. There were two lines of questioning. I'm kind of tempted. One is the experience of fear, because one thing I've noticed coming back was something that fascinated me about the stories my friends were telling me from the Maidan. That one of the things that struck me is how many people said, well, it's strange because you're never nervous when you're there, but as soon as you leave and you're watching on television or watching on the internet, you're terrified. You know, and so at a certain moment, paradoxically, as the danger on the Maidan increased, you know, and as that revolutionary moment and the violence of the regime intensified, people are like, I was too panicked to be anywhere else except there, you know, which is precisely the place where you're in danger. And so I was very interested in that and how that happened, especially because I'm a deeply cowardly person in general. And a lot of the people I'm physically cowardly, like, you know, I've never thought I would like stand up under being shot. And a lot of the people I was in touch with, it's not like the people I know tend to be like, you know, the security guards. And I mean, I know a lot of people I knew in the Maidan were, you know, were people who were either frail or they were older, or, you know, I have this account of, you know, Lena Finberg, who is this, you know, Jewish grandmother, you know, in her 60s, who's kind of chubby and walks with a limp, and racing down Kristyatic, you know, to try to treat people who were being shot, you know, and it's, you know, if you look at her, she doesn't look like the kind of person who would be racing through a sniper massacre. And yet she said, you know, there was no choice. I understood immediately what I had to do. And no, I didn't feel afraid at that moment. It wasn't until I came home that I was afraid. And I was fascinated by that, you know, and that was something that came back, you know, when the war started. And you write about that in the book, that paradoxically, the closer you get to the front and the closer you get to danger, like the calmer you feel. And it's when you're thinking about it. And I thought about that. I thought about that again because I was just in Kyiv over spring break. And it wasn't the first time I'd been to Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. It was the first time I'd been to Kyiv. And I knew they were running out of air defense, which was a question, like, am I going to go if they've run out of air defense? And I was very like, and my kids knew it was dangerous, and they were like, Mommy, please don't die. Please don't die. I'm like, am I really going to do this to them? Do I really have to make this trip? And I was so nervous. I'm like, okay, like I increased my dose of anti-anxiety medication. Like before I'm going, I'm like, I really want to do this, but I don't know if I can calm down. And as soon as I got on that train from Helm, I felt great. Like, like even like in the bomb shelters in Kyiv, I felt fine. Like, I don't know, you're sucking up the energy of the people around you. The Ukrainians are used to it. They're kind of calm. They're making coffee. You can like how that I find that kind of phenomenologically fascinating.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk more about your experience of how fear operates.
I mean, there's a clarity, you know, again, it's just like when there's a lot going on around you and it's uncertain, like your body is processing all of that information, and all you have to go on is, you know, your past experience basically. And so you're constantly calculating like in relation to your near environment. I did travel back to the States. This is the third time I've come back, basically once each year since the full-scale invasion. And, you know, again, when I'm at a distance, you have to like imagine what's happening in Ukraine. And obviously your imagination fills in for all the blanks, and it goes wild, you know, it goes to the fear. It's really, I mean, I think it's your imagination that creates the fear, really, because you're imagining something bad happening to you. You're imagining pain, you know, you've been injured once before. And so you're going to imagine that, since, you know, you're going to imagine what you know. If you have, you know, again, close people who have been killed in certain circumstances, that's where your mind's going to go. Whereas, like, I spent the summer, couple months of the summer of 2022 in Mykolaiv, which is a southern city couple hours east of Odessa. It was some 10-15 miles from the front line at the time. It was being bombarded by artillery, missiles every single day. It was a dangerous place to be. I would say I was probably in like the less, I mean, it's interesting, right? There's always like a more danger, because I mean, even in Mykolaiv, like, you know, geographically, I was in the part of the city which was the safest. Like, you know, my friends who I was working with who were in the military, you know, I was like, oh, let's go to this, you know, volunteer warehouse. I want to see what it looks like. She's like, you know, I don't think I'm going to take you there. She's like, you know, you have to drive down the road and be swerving through mines. And I'm like, maybe you don't need to see that warehouse really. And so I guess like the thing that you do when you are in a situation like that, like I had made a decision that I'm going to work in this place to fundraise with this particular military unit. And the minute you go there, you also like, you prioritize. My priority is to do this work. You hear things exploding, you know, it's not every single second, but you know, I mean, it's consistent. And so you very quickly, your body is very smart. You begin to tell like this sound is in a different part of the city. I'm not going to think about something exploding, you know, halfway across the city. When it's louder, you're like, okay, that was closer. It's really loud. You think, okay, I'm going to go into the hallway. Like you begin to just rely on your senses. I mean, it's an interesting thing based on what you were saying, even with like, should I go to Ukraine from the United States or not? Because you're using your rational thinking. Whereas when you're in Mykolaiv, you know, working with the military, or I mean, I can project that this is how people, you know, who are literally on the front, you know, you have assignments. And so you're not thinking about your safety until it's really in danger. And obviously, you know, how to say, you're obviously at risk. You also accept the risk that you could be killed. And so you don't worry about it because you just realize you're like, I'm going to do everything that I can to not, you know, get into a sticky situation in the moment, but I'm not trying, you know, it's kind of like fleeing preemptively or fleeing the invasion. You stop thinking about keeping yourself preemptively. You've made a decision, like a kind of entire decision that I'm doing something that's dangerous. And then, you know, you use your intelligence to kind of get through, what's the word, you know, to deal with that environment that you're in.
Let me ask one more question, and I'll look it up to the audience about my existentialist preoccupation about this making decisions. These one of the at a certain point you cite Judith Butler, you know, with this question: can we have it both ways? Can you be anti-war? Can you be a pacifist? Can you be anti-violence and still support Ukraine? You know, and still support, you know, people who are under attack? You know, can you have these universalist commitments, you know, and keep them, you know, at moments of historical extremity, you know, or are there moments that force you to make choices that you could not have imagined making earlier? You know, which is something, again, like even I'm not, you know, I have not lived this war the way you have, and I related so well to some of these questions. Like when you said at a certain point that your mother said like, oh, I'm wishing you this, and I'm wishing we can send some more artillery. And you're like, artillery was not a year ago part of my active vocabulary, which I totally related to. Like I had never even let my kids have a squirt gun. And at a certain point, like after this full-scale invasion started, I find myself, you know, on the train to Washington, you know, to plead with Congress to immediately send lethal weapons to Ukraine. And I'm texting with friends in Ukraine and trying to figure out, I'm like, okay, guys, tell me what is the one thing you need the most. You know, and I didn't even know the names of these weapons, you know, a couple months earlier. I'm the last person who would know the names of these weapons. A former student of mine who's a career military officer was like, okay, Marci, I've made you up a cheat sheet. You know, here are all the weapons in very simple explanations. And this is why this one would be more useful than this one. If it's still too complicated, call me, I'll make it more simple. You know, at a certain point, I was texting with Yurko Parhasko, who's a literary translator and a psychoanalyst in Lviv, who also is the last person who would know anything about weapons. And I'm like, okay, tell me what is the one thing you think? He's like, well, I think it's these atoms. And he's texting me in Polish, and he said, but you know, Marci, I feel immodest even talking about this. What do I know? I'm like, you feel immodest. It's completely It's like, I can't even believe these words are coming out of my mouth. I can't believe it. But here I am, and I've made the choice, and I'm going to go plead for these weapons, which is not something I ever could have imagined. And so the sense of being forced to make choices that completely reorient your worldview, that force you to question all sorts of humanist and universalist and cosmopolitan and and pacifist inclinations. Like, what does war do to you that way, and what does that mean for how your choices and your responses are formative of who you are?
Yeah. Okay. Beautiful. Everything you just said is because I mean, you actually kind of answered a question I had in my head as I was coming down here. I wanted to ask you about how your encounter with Ukraine has changed you, and maybe it's more broad. But, some of the things you've said are already. It's a beautiful example of the way that engaging with something as reality changes you. And so I would almost venture to guess that war is a very extreme thing. It's something, again, when an entire country is trying to kill you, that's a very, it's hard to turn away from that, and look the other way. But what we see again in the United States and in Europe is that people manage to do that still. And I think maybe that's it, that war is just such an extreme thing that the biggest lesson that I took from it is this idea that this is really happening, that you can't wish it away. You can't think up some kind of intelligent scheme to rationally. I mean, that essay that Judith Butler wrote, where she really tried to argue philosophically that I am anti-war and any kind of military aggression is bad, but I understand, here I'm filling in, but obviously she wanted to support the Ukrainians, probably because that was the politically appropriate thing to do. And and it just falls apart when you hit up against flesh and blood that is mortal. And I would like to think that a person doesn't have to physically live through war in order to be able to relate to the things around them as real and to take them seriously. Something that it came to me, I guess, only when I was writing the introduction to this book last summer, but it was really kind of an important thought was this fact that I grew up again in this family of people who had been forced to flee their homes, Ukraine, during World War II, and I always thought that something happened to them, and that forced their life to go in this path, and that shaped who they were. And then all of a sudden, once I had my own experience where you could choose to do this or you could choose to do that, it's the way that you respond to the things that happen to you that makes you who you are. And I think when you are in these situations of danger, or ethical situations, for example, right, that and I think you've written about this too, is that there are choices when you're faced with these two choices. Sometimes there's something you're if I choose that, I will no longer be who I am. I will no longer be able to live with myself, and so you choose that.
Let's let the audience ask some questions.
So I want to bring it back, Marci, to something you mentioned at the beginning, which is dance.
Yeah.
So I saw so many things that shocked me, mostly obviously sitting here in Madison, but I remember seeing a woman in her kitchen, an old woman, grandmother type, cooking in her kitchen. And we could see this because the front of the building had been bombed off and the kitchen was, and she's just cooking. I remember seeing people performing a play in the midst of this war. And so when you were talking at the beginning about dance, I was curious about at what point were you able to dance again? And were you able to use it in the service of these causes, or was it just for you? I mean, it's remarkable that you were able to say, that you had the courage to say, but then it also takes a certain kind of courage to perform. So I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm glad you brought that up because one thing, and Marci can attest to this also because you were just in Kyiv in March, right? Right now, like at the present moment, Kyiv has got an incredibly thriving cultural scene. Like, theater. I go to the theater whenever I can. I've been to the movie theater. Like I've gone to the movies more often than I used to, before 2022, which obviously was really not often, but still, I mean, like, and what I was doing until the full scale invasion, like very avidly, was dancing Lindy Hop, which is, like this very bouncy, lively partner dance, done to swing music. And where am I going with all of this? Anyways, that was curtailed immediately. But I would say the first time I did that kind of dancing was in the summertime. And it was very emotional and it was very nourishing. It was just, and basically I would say probably from sometime in 2022, especially in Kyiv, the Lindy Hop community has been really active. Sometimes even hyperactive. Like in 2023, I mean, I was some 4 nights a week in the summer, you could go dance to live music in Kyiv. I mean, it was ridiculous. Like in my case, I can't devote as much time to it as I used to, simply because there are other things that I need to do that are more important. But the fact that these people in the community are like keeping it alive, it means whenever I have a free moment, I can go and dance. And it's hugely like, I don't know, again, it's touch, it's music, it's sharing something with community. It's incredible. Like I have a friend who's an American vet who's been working in Ukraine since 2022 as an evacuation medic. So obviously some of the things that he sees and has to deal with are very difficult. And whenever he's back in Kyiv, he will go to a dance. And and he travels light, so he's always in his uniform. And he tells me how when he goes to these dances, like the people who are civilians and haven't enlisted, they are like, oh, we're so sorry that we're dancing. And he says, no, I'm so glad that you're here dancing, because like if you can be dancing, that makes everything else that we're doing, there is nobody wants to live the way a person has to live at the time. Nobody wants to endure that. There needs to be something else that we're protecting. There needs to be something else to come back to have a break, to clear your head, to just remind what life is really about.
Maybe I'll just add to that about that space, that creative space. One thing I know, so I had all these, I want to say banal, but that's not the right word, but all these kind of usual academic intellectual things scheduled with Ukrainian colleagues before the full-scale invasion. I mean, you had a translation project, or a conference was in the works, or there was a Zoom seminar, about this or about that, with combining your students. And when February 24th happened, my thought was, of course, we cancel everything. And the last thing I want is one of my Ukrainian colleagues, like on Zoom, talking about, Frankfurt School and critical theory, and meanwhile misses like an air raid alarm and gets killed. So I'm like, no, absolutely not. And then suddenly I realized after a week or two that despite the fact that the Battle of Kyiv is going on, people wanted to.
Yeah.
Like people were like, no, I don't want to cancel. Like, no, even if people had to be there like with a black screen because it wasn't safe to like have their location disclosed, some of my colleagues were like, no, I want to do this. I want to participate. I want to go ahead with this discussion. I want to go ahead with this book talk. I want to go ahead with this. And my first thought was, no, I can't deal with the guilt if I distract you. And then I was like, no, it has to be their decision.
Yeah.
Like they're the ones in this situation and I have to let it be their decision. And it was clear that there was something that was really important that intellectual life go on, and that's been incredible. Like it's an incredibly moving thing to see. And it was very selfishly one of the reasons I wanted to be in Kyiv, because I felt it's not only that intellectual life was going on, but like, as you write, there's an intensification.
Yeah.
It's everything is as it was, but more so. that the stakes are so high. And in some ways you get this a kind of epistemological clarity because everything is so sharp and it's life and death. Like I did this discussion with Volodya Yermolenko and Tanya Agarkova at Kyiv School of Economics about Grenzerfahrungen, this kind of German philosophical concept about limit experiences outside the everyday that like Karl Jaspers believed that's what pushes us to philosophy, that which can't be, that which can't otherwise be understood in the context of the everyday. And there are like air raid sirens, going off from Kyiv, and people stayed for hours. Like I couldn't believe, like rapt attention, of this overflowing room. I couldn't believe how long we were talking when it was done. Like of all these young people who wanted to talk about philosophy precisely now, and in some sense not despite the war, but because of the war, and that kind of intensity, that sense of, it's not, on the one hand, you think like, well, it seems decadent from the outside, but maybe it's not decadent. Maybe it's precisely the thing that's essential. Maybe it's precisely the thing that keeps people safe.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, there's something about like when you know that you can be killed at any moment, like whatever is superfluous, it drops away. Yeah.
You were talking about how there's this sort of hereditary trauma that Ukrainians have. I also wonder about a hereditary feistiness. Because I have a Ukrainian friend. I'm a musician, he's a composer, and somebody asked her, like, well, what's the difference between Russians and Ukrainians? She says, okay, you take away a freedom from a Ukrainian, they pick up a pitchfork, they take up a rock, whatever. You take away a freedom from a Russian and they take a selfie of themselves. But that says that freedom is our birthright, and we believe we have a right to fight for it, and this is part of who we are. Do you have any comments about that? How, because we were all shocked and amazed at how quickly the Ukrainians mobilized and united and just defended.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's something really admirable about Ukrainians. It's definitely, it's something that I think people around the world, why did people kind of rally to support Ukraine immediately? Because they saw that there was something really special there. They saw a spark of a kind of, how democracy can actually function, like what really is freedom, right? It's not, excuse me, it's not about, what bathroom you're allowed to go into, but, I mean, it's really, it's something very fundamental. And there's also something that I need to use this moment to remind all of us the fact that while Ukrainians have this spirit to defend themselves, there's only so much a human being or a group of human beings can do against a Russian missile, or 100 Russian missiles, or daily barrages of Russian missiles for 700 and how many, 50 something days already. And it's wonderful to celebrate, one of the things that I want to do is kind of just to share both the complexity of war and the beauty of this, Ukrainian spirit of resistance, and also just to remind everybody in the United States that spirit alone, it can do a lot. It really can, and I think it can do more than we think it can. I mean, that's what we've seen, that it really, honestly, and thinking and attention and philosophy have great power. They're really important. I think that's the other thing. Like, we shouldn't give those things up because they have a power that is not visible in a material way, but it certainly is. It is a force, and in addition to that, we need weapons. We just need lots of weapons. We need American weapons, European weapons, high quality weapons, without, what's the word, limitations on where we can use those weapons. And just kind of a trust that, the Ukrainians have certainly proven themselves to be intelligent enough. I mean, that is what freedom is, right? Is like, if you have your own country, to be able to defend yourself the way that you understand you need to do it, because you understand better than anybody else.
So yes, we have a vote coming up on Saturday, and we should all be calling our congressman. Even though we think that our congressman will do the right thing. We need
But let's encourage them.
Let's call them.
And tell them how much. we
And if you don't know how to
appreciate
do that, ask me afterwards. But my other question for you is, how else can we help? You had mentioned you were doing some fundraising. What organizations can we help, can we help you help?
I have a great organization that I've been working with since that summer in Kyiv. They have developed their own drone. Again, in Kyiv, they were like literally taping cardboard together and like, trying things out. And at this point, it's been functional for, for a year and a half. They use it in battle. And I have little, I have bookmarks. I will give you bookmarks. Anybody who wants, I'll give you bookmarks with a website with a link where you can go and you can donate money to them electronically. Because what's also great is that they're not only, developing Ukraine's domestic military capacity, but they are also kind of reshaping how the military can cooperate with, civilian engineers and producers, again, to be able to defend themselves more efficiently. So, thank you. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we will have signings. There are books available from both authors, and then we can just talk afterwards. But I want to thank you both for being here, and thank you all for coming to the wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm going to have Larissa move over here and sit here.